Blanche Taylor Moore was born under the name Blanche Kisser on February 17, 1933. South of Burlington, a city located in Alamance County in the state of North Carolina in the United States. She was the fifth of 7 children from the marriage of Parker Davis Kisser, known to everyone as Parker Davis, and her mother, Flanny Blanche Honeycutt Kisser, who was affectionately called Flanny. To understand the family dynamics of the Kisers, it's important to know that Parker Davis, the father, was a Baptist preacher belonging to the group of preachers who proudly called themselves primitive preachers, who were those who preached a literal interpretation of the Bible, a tradition they brought from the old preaching camps that were held back in the 18th century. But behind the facade of a just and devout man, busy with the things of God and constantly worried about his family, hid the reality of an abusive alcoholic who hardly ever contributed to the family's livelihood. It is known that P.D. always made money with his churches, and I say churches in plural, because this man had times when he would stay away from drinking, open a church, and start working with his preaching, which really managed to attract many new members. People even came from other towns, from the factories and tobacco companies that were around, and they would sit and watch, with great admiration for this man who seemed to have a direct link with God. But sooner or later, I lived in ecstasy. With so much attention, he began to have intimate encounters with women. Then he would return to drinking and end up closing the church because of his debts. This was a routine that happened over and over again, and during the periods when this man was dedicated to drinking, he worked selling insurance to the women who worked in the factories, a job for which he was very good, considering his ease of speech. But everything he earned, he lost in gambling and didn't give a penny to his family. Flanny, his wife, had to work full-time in factories to be able to pay the rent for the house and put food on the table. Let's remember that they had 7 children. So out of the $40 that Flanny earned, she had to give half to P.D., who never hid the fact that he spent it all on young girls. Additionally, this man was extremely strict with his children, especially with the girls. He would periodically check their clothes to make sure they were modest enough, if not raggedy. He wouldn't let them participate in any extracurricular activities, and they had to come home immediately. In addition, he physically abused them, as well as Flanny. So, as soon as Blanche was old enough, she started working in the downtown stores, with the sole purpose of buying clothes, which she obviously had to hide from her father. Blanche was a beautiful young woman who attracted the attention of boys, something that P.D. clearly noticed right away and took advantage of. There is an episode in Blanche's life, which is narrated in Jim Schutz's book, Preacher's Girl, The Life and Crimes of Blanche, Taylor Moore, where it tells that Parker Davis forced his daughter to have sex with men as a way to pay off his debts. The
preacher leaned over the car seat, breathing whiskey-scented air, and said softly, "Honey, do you see that man over there?" "Yes, sir, I'm going to stop under that tree." "When you do, I want you to go force that man. Why do you want me to do that?" The preacher lowered his head a bit and breathed. She could see how his eyes hardened and his jaw tensed. "Sweetheart, I want you to do what I tell you." "Why?" she asked, pouting, ready to take the hit. But he just stared at his fists, where he was gripping the steering wheel. He didn't want to hit her at that moment. "I owe that man a lot of money. If you don't help me, it will be very bad for everyone," he assured. "He won't hurt you. I'm going to see them." She looked at the man. He was smiling and drunk.
Clearly, Blanche wanted to leave home as quickly as possible. But being the daughter of a preacher, she would only leave the family home, married to a respectable man. So it was that at 19 years old, she met James Taylor, who was 24. He was the second to last of the 11, children of the marriage, made up by William and Isla Taylor. They were known for being a warm and solid family, but James was the one who stood out the least among his brothers. To put it in some way, he dropped out of high school and served in the Army in World War II. He drank a lot and was a gambler, so he often lost all the money he made restoring fine furniture, a job he performed with great skill and which was also highly respected in that region. Blanche and James got married on May 29, 1952, a few months after meeting Ralph, James's older brother, and his wife. As witnesses, the Taylor family was really uneasy about how quickly things had escalated. James's sisters were a bit distant with the new member of their family, but Ralph knew immediately that she was James's dream come true. Blanche was a beautiful and voluptuous woman. She had a slim waist and was extremely outgoing. She liked to always be on the move, and she loved to have fun, just like James. She liked to talk about sports, crimes, Wall Street, religion, and politics with men, which completely fascinated them. In addition to the fact that Blanche could go from saying the most Christian phrase anyone could hear to speaking in double entendre, making sexual references in a matter of seconds. She loved making spicy comments and throwing sexual references all the time. And of course, this made the rest of the women distrust her. During the first year of their marriage, they had their first daughter, Vanessa. The marriage often faced some financial difficulties, so James's brothers used to give him some loans to help them get by. But in 1953, Blanche decided to look for a job and start working as a cashier at Kroger, a supermarket company that set up a branch in Burlington. But of course, Blanche wouldn't just be a cashier. Her admission was much bigger. We're talking about the 50s, a time when high-ranking positions were totally segregated and intended only for men. But Blanche was an ambitious woman and with an overwhelming charisma, so she was willing to do anything to get what she wanted. People would line up at her register just to be served by her. And not only the men with whom Blanche openly flirted, but also the women who were fascinated by her, who, in addition to being an extremely kind and attentive woman, remembered absolutely all the names of the customers. And not only that, but she remembered details that they shared with her. For example, if any of them mentioned that they had a sick relative, on their next visit, she would ask how that relative was doing. Those kinds of details turned the now known as Miss Blanche Taylor into a truly particular case. But, unlike the customers, her coworkers did not look very kindly on Blanche, because they labeled her as hypocritical and vengeful. With them, and even some cashiers suspected that she was stealing money from the cash registers because she had a tendency to take her colleagues' cash registers on loan. Instead of sticking to the anti-theft protocols that the company had put forward, it was also obvious that she flirted with all the men who had any higher rank. So it was until 1959 came along, the year her second daughter, Cindy, was born. But it was also the year that Blanche achieved her goal. She was promoted to head cashier, the highest rank that women could hold at Kroger. Although it's true, she did not have the ability to hire or fire people within her duties. She was in charge of all the other cashiers. She was responsible for training them, and she was also in charge of the restockers, and those known as back boys, or bag boys, who were these boys who worked helping to pack all the products that customers bought and accompany them to their cars. Apparently, a lot of things happened in 1959. Another one was that Flonnie asked Parker Davis for a divorce. Blanche's father, 3 years after this man left their home, to, in his own words, find a younger woman, thus leaving their dependent children in total abandonment. On the other hand, one of the events that undoubtedly marked that year was the marriage between Blanche and James. Began to crumble. Some people close to the couple indicated that it was all due to James having aged drastically in recent months, and that this had caused Blanche to no longer feel sexually attracted to him. It turns out that, in a very strange way, and in a short time, James Taylor gained a lot of weight. He was going bald in his early 40s, and Blanche's attitude towards him had become quite cold. James was completely convinced that she was cheating on him. There were certain signs that obviously made James realize that something was happening. To start with, the family had only one vehicle, which was usually driven by him. But all of a sudden, Blanche began to have full availability. of a car from the Kroger company. She was the main cashier, but clearly her position did not enjoy the privilege of having a vehicle assigned at her disposal. That is, she was not that important. It was also not essential for her to have a car. So, one night, James decided to confront her at dinner in front of their daughters and questioned her, asking for explanations about it. Blanche didn't say anything. She just stayed quiet, looking at her plate. And James kept repeating the question over and over again, until, enraged, he threw the chocolate dessert he was eating in her face. Vanessa, the eldest daughter, ran to her room. Cindy, who was still very little, cried from her chair, and that's when James told her. Rather, he asked her, very annoyed, if she was actually not having sex with her supervisor. All this while he kept throwing dessert at her head. She just managed to stare at him while she cleaned her face. This would not go unpunished, but James would never know. Despite this, in the early 60s, James managed to control his drinking addiction and broke all contact with his gaming companions. He joined the Baptist Church, became an active member, and began to devote his free time to photography, a hobby that strongly connected him with his daughters, because he loved capturing moments with them. He also constantly took her to his mother's house, Ela, where, along with his nephews, they spent pleasant moments recording home videos. For her part, Blanche spent her free time selling products. Tupperware, the food storage containers known worldwide as Tuppers, which were in their prime at that time. As expected, Blanche was an excellent saleswoman, but most of the time she used the well-known Tupperware parties as an excuse to cover up her infidelities. Just as the relationship between the couple cooled down in the same way, Blanche began to distance herself from the Taylor family. She had always gotten along well with Isla, James's mother, but lately, at the few family gatherings she attended, Blanche spent her time complaining about James in multiple aspects. About his physique, about how much she claimed he spent on videotapes, and about his inability to even buy a pair of stockings for their daughters. Isla always kept her thoughts to herself, but on that occasion, she couldn't help but tell her that, in her opinion, her son did everything possible to make her happy, and the least Blanche could do was to spend a moment with the family. Clearly, she did not take these words well at all, and at the same time, Dot, and one of James's sisters, asked him to take care of his daughters and stop leaving them in the care of their mother, who by that point was already an elderly woman. Obviously, Blanche told her that the girls also had a father, and she left the place to meet another man, whom we will talk about in a few minutes. Blanche had Isla in her sights, but she preferred to keep it a secret. Obviously, Blanche was fed up with James, but she wasn't going to tell him. She preferred to keep her affairs outside of the marriage while still being married to him, and she wouldn't leave him until she had something certain. And so it was that September of 1966 arrived, and died suddenly at the age of 62. It was determined that the cause of his death was a heart attack triggered by chronic emphysema. It all started 24 hours earlier. The preacher was going about his business as usual, when suddenly he began to writhe in pain while clutching his stomach. The vomiting and diarrhea soon followed. His nose and throat became irritated. His hands and feet went numb, and a very peculiar sign also became evident. A strong garlic breath came out of his mouth. He had been a drinker all his life, so the doctors almost immediately concluded that his alcoholism was taking its toll. Some years later, in November of 1970, Isla Taylor, who by then was apparently 83 years old, was bedridden. Due to a series of hospital visits for some health complications related to the heart and lungs, she gradually weakened, and in her last days, a severe stomach burn took her breath away. Isla died surrounded by her entire family, and the official cause of her death was a cerebral hemorrhage. Blanche found her second home in the Kroger supermarket. She loved her job, and lately, the operations in the store had improved quite a bit. All of this was due to the arrival of a young and enthusiastic assistant manager named Reid, who was only 3 years younger than Blanche. He came from Danville, in California, and had started working at Kroger at the age of 16. Since then, he began to create a quite solid career path. That case with Linda Thompson, a beautiful and lively young woman, 7 years younger than him, with whom he had 2 children. For Raymond, Kroger was the work of his life, and he followed to the letter all the company's rules, from punctuality to the dress code. Absolutely nothing escaped him. When he arrived at the Burlington headquarters, where he worked, Blanche immediately knew who she was and all the affairs she had had with some of the sub-managers and supervisors there. Despite it obviously being forbidden, it didn't surprise him at all, and it didn't seem like anything new. But indeed, Blanche seemed to him a beautiful woman. He liked her, but he made it clear from the very beginning that he was not interested in sleeping with her. Blanche was a cunning woman, and of course, she was not going to miss the opportunity to obtain the man she wanted. So she didn't try to seduce him, nor did she use her tricks to make him fall at her feet, but rather, she became a great friend to him. Little by little, she became a part of his life, and even became friends with Linda, his wife, for whom she even organized a baby shower when she was expecting their second child. Everything was going according to Blanche's plan, until a few months later, an incident occurred that almost ruined all her plans. One day, James got drunk, and in mid-morning, when the store was usually busiest, he showed up at the door of Kroger asking for his wife to come over. When she goes to James, everyone in the place starts to watch and listen to their argument. Raymond, who was in his office without knowing anything about what was happening, goes in front of them and greets James saying, "Good morning, Mr. Taylor." To which he responds by abruptly grabbing him by the elbow and starts yelling at him if he was sleeping with his wife. To which she replied to stop yelling and that he's going to make her lose her job, making it impossible to support their children. Reid tried, without any success, to ask James to leave the place, but when he couldn't, he practically begged Blanche to get him out of the store. And so she did, while telling her husband that everything was a lie, that he was drunk, and that all he was doing was causing her a big problem. Everyone at Kroger witnessed what had happened, and now they were wondering if the accusations of an affair between Blanche and Raymond were true. But neither party mentioned anything about it, and they carried on with their lives as if nothing had happened. Until, shortly after, Reid was appointed store manager. Now nothing was going to stop her. Blanche immediately launched a whole campaign to seduce him. Blanche, a Christian woman with a mischievous side, began by toning down her double entendres. She knew that Raymond enjoyed watching the television preachers, who were very popular at that time, like Rex Humbert and Jimmy Swaggart. So she dedicated herself to watching them on television and talked about these people with Raymond whenever she could. All this without yet leaving James, who obviously carried within him the humiliation of knowing that he was being cheated on. So much so that in 1969, when she was returning home after not being able to get to the city center because the streets were blocked by various racial protests, she had trouble breathing, and suddenly she was overcome with vomiting and violent diarrhea. The doctor told her the next day that she had had a very serious heart attack, so she needed to slow down her pace of life and take things more calmly if she wanted to avoid an accident. So James could no longer afford to get angry. On her part, Blanche had made progress with Raymond. They were now very close friends, enjoyed lengthy conversations and each other's company, but she had not yet reached a more intimate level, something that was about to change, because in 1971, Raymond and his wife decided to divorce. At this point in the story, Blanche was 100% convinced that Raymond Reid was the ideal man, so as soon as she heard about the divorce, Blanche became the unconditional woman for him. She became much more intense. She became his faithful advisor, his protector, and even when Raymond moved to another apartment, she ran out in the early morning to make him breakfast, telling James that the poor man was alone and helpless. Obviously, everyone at Kroger started saying that they were having an affair. And James knew it. By September of 1973, At 43 years old, James began showing symptoms of what seemed to be a common flu. He had a severe sore throat, swollen glands, but he also had one of the worst cases of diarrhea he had ever experienced in his life. Over the days, painful blisters began to appear on his hands and feet. His hair was falling out in clumps, his face was completely swollen, and there was even blood in his waist. Of course, all of these symptoms couldn't be even the worst flu. So he went to the doctor, and even he had no idea what was happening to him. He underwent numerous tests, but nothing seemed to lead to a correct diagnosis. James was really unwell, and on the last night of his life, Blanche decided to prepare dinner, so she called him to eat. At that moment, James had an extremely sore throat and didn't want to be able to eat anything. So, in what seemed to be a gesture of humanity, Blanche approached her husband, touched his forehead, stroked his head, and comforted him. It was a strange moment of tenderness in a marriage that had been fragmented for years. And in the end, she convinced him to have some ice cream to perhaps alleviate his sore throat a bit. He sat at the table and ate it slowly, while Cindy and Blanche ate beside him. After an hour, James was in bed, writhing in pain. His eyes bulged. The vomiting continued to get stronger. He was saying nonsensical things, and the abdominal pains seemed to tear his body apart. By then, Vanessa, his eldest daughter, was already 20 years old and had become independent, while Cindy, 14, still lived with her parents. Blanche told her younger daughter that she would have to call the doctor in the morning because she didn't think they would attend to him at that hour. She left James alone with all his symptoms, sent Cindy to her room, and she settled down to sleep in the living room. Since she also had diarrhea the last few weeks, a result of a chronic condition she had since she was young, she lay down on the couch and listened to the long, heartbreaking screams of pain coming from the main room until she fell asleep. When she woke up early in the morning, she discovered that James had already passed away. She found him on his side, with his hands stretched out as if trying to grab the air, and his face was a deep blue color, almost violet. Blanche left the room, closed the door, told Cindy what had happened, and then called Vanessa and her sister-in-law Dot to give them the news. Except she didn't tell Dot that James had already died, but rather that she couldn't wake him up. She also notified Raymond Reid, who arrived immediately and stayed by her side as long as necessary. The doctors determined that the cause of James Taylor's death was a massive heart attack. But years later, Dot would reveal that she and her siblings, who were in good health, even in their old age, thought it was too strange that everyone in their family had long lives, except James, who was one of the youngest. So they felt that something was not right, that something did not add up. Finally, his death certificate indicated that he had a history of 4 to 5 years of heart problems. The years following James's death were the best years of Blanche's life. The romance between her and Raymond, at last, was a reality. But each lived in their own home and was independent. They spent time together, slept together, but the rest of the time each did things on their own. And Blanche liked that, who, by the way, cut off all kinds of relationship with the family. Taylor sold the house where she lived with James and paid the down payment for a new house on Hamilton Street. Raymond Reid was really enjoying his current life. He had managed to overcome some differences with the mother of his children. His little ones were growing up well. They had jobs and a beautiful woman by their side. But the Kroger store, where he worked with Blanche, was not producing the numbers the company thought it needed to keep it open. So Kroger sent the regional manager, Robert Hutton, to see if he could detect the problem. Robert was also a guy who, like Raymond, had made a career line at Kroger. But he had two ways of treating his subordinates. He was either cold and formal with most of them, or he was obscene, lascivious, scandalous, and insistent with the women who worked in his stores. He was a vulgar person. He loved to tell dirty jokes, and the more explicit, the better. And although he was not to Raymond's liking, there was no doubt that Blanche could not overlook him. Eventually, the Burlington store closed due to changes in the real estate sector that directly affected demand. But both Blanche and Raymond were relocated by different stores until they ended up working alongside Robert Hutton at the same branch, located on Battleground Road. And whenever Robert was in the store, Blanche would flutter around him, trying to draw his attention to how from the place. Until finally, one day, this man asked her what was going on between her and Raymond, to which she replied that they were no longer dating. Raymond's physique had changed because he was very short and had gained too much weight. They had a relationship of more than 10 years. People change, but it was a lie that they were not together. In fact, they were dating and always argued for the same reason. Raymond wanted to marry Blanche, and she, for some reason, didn't want to. Robert Hutton took this response as a hint from the woman and constantly called her to his office, trying to seduce her to confirm his insinuations, as he used to do with all the female workers who crossed his path. But Blanche always refused. She flirted with him, touched him, told him things like she had dreamed about him. Even, Hutton would wait for her in his office with his member in his hand directly. But Blanche never let him get away with it. Until one day, she decided to take advantage of this behavior. It was October 16th, 1985, and everyone at Kroger. They were preparing because the next day, there would be a zone meeting at the event store offices, which several company executives would attend. So Blanche informed her colleagues that they would be in the meeting room organizing and cleaning so that everything would be ready. She took her purse, which seemed strange to everyone, and went up with Willis up the Grove, a young man who worked in the warehouse to whom she asked for help moving some boxes full of new uniforms that had been left in the conference room. They moved everything to a small closet at the end of the hallway. And when they finished, she told Willis that he could go back to his duties and that she would stay for some final touches. When Willis left, Blanche put her purse in a locker, but not before taking out her car keys. She returns to the conference room, and suddenly Robert Hutton appears on the scene. Blanche was picking up a pair of women's uniform pants that were thrown in a corner, and this scene triggered Hutton's fantasies, who immediately stripped off all his clothes and stood naked in front of her, saying, "Don't you want some of this white thing?" And Blanche replied, "Whatever I can. But let me first make sure there are no Moors on the coast." So she turned off the lights, grabbed all the clothes that were on the floor, and ran out of the place. While she was yelling, "Mr. Hutton, I have your clothes, I'm leaving. You've treated me like a damn prostitute all the time." She ran out the front door of the store yelling, "I have his pants, Mr. Hutton is upstairs, naked." Hutton got caught. He found nothing he could cover himself with, because Blanche had made sure to lock the closet where she put the uniforms, so Robert Hutton had no choice but to run out. While he covered his private parts, he yelled at a butcher to pass him a white coat. A few days later, what they feared so much happened. Blanche's lawyers delivered a lawsuit for a total of $14 million against Robert Hutton for workplace harassment and also against Kroger for being a place where all its workers were harassed and sexually assaulted by their male superiors, which was not a lie. But of course, Blanche had planned all this, and Robert Hutton had fallen into her trap. It seemed that life gave no respite to Blanche, because, in addition to this lawsuit taking a long time to resolve, the house she had bought after James' death suffered a fire. But the circumstances in which this happened were, to say the least, strange. It was January of 1985, and Blanche called Raymond, screaming desperately that her house was on fire. Obviously, this man, who loved her with all his heart, rushed to the place as fast as he could, and when he arrived, Blanche ran into her house, which was still in flames. The firefighters already had everything under control, so they didn't stop her. And once they got to her room, they discovered all the lingerie that Blanche owned. All kinds of underwear, obviously already charred, scattered all over the place. Blanche quickly said that she was sure a pervert had started the fire, as she had seen a man lurking in her garden that day. The fire department concluded that it had indeed been an arson, apparently with sexual connotations. So, shortly after, Blanche collected her house insurance and sold it as it was. And with that money, she bought a mobile home in a trailer park near Deep Creek Church Road, very close to her daughter Cindy's house. By this point, she was no longer working at Kroger and set up a business selling restored mobile homes with her daughters and sons-in-law. A month after the fire, Raymond went to pick up Blanche from her new home to go to church together after she had persistently asked him to. And as they were leaving in the car, Raymond saw through the rearview mirror that the trailer at Blanche's mobile home was on fire. He stopped abruptly, but Blanche told him it was nothing, that it seemed to be the sun reflecting, and insisted on leaving so as not to be late. But Raymond didn't listen to her and turned around. Indeed, it was burning, so he made his way through the smoke and fire, took an extinguisher, and managed to put out the flames, although by that time they had already caused quite a bit of damage. Again, Blanche's underwear was scattered all over the room, along with the remains of a large wax candle. Blanche claimed her house insurance again, but this time Raymond was convinced that she had provoked it. Things were not entirely right with Raymond. He was constantly insisting to Blanche that they should get married, but she always had 1,000 excuses not to do it. Until, little by little, the rumors reached her ears. Everything seemed to indicate that Blanche had met a preacher and was planning to marry him. It was Easter Sunday of 1985, and Blanche accompanied her sister, Temperance, to a small town on the outskirts of Burlington to attend the Easter sunrise service at the United Church of Christ of Carolina, because it was a tradition that her sister and her husband did every year. But with her husband admitted to the hospital, she asked Blanche to accompany her this time. That year would not only be Blanche's first time at the place, but also the Reverend's, Dwight Moore, who had recently taken over as pastor of the local church, and he wanted to make a good first impression. He began his sermon by telling the biblical story of when Simon Peter denied Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed, and from the very beginning, Blanche looked at him doubtfully, as he was not the type of preacher she liked. Like those who watch television with Raymond Dwight Moore, he was different. He had a soft and thoughtful style, and in the middle of his sermon, he commented, "Imagine how unusual the scene is. Have you ever heard a rooster crow in the middle of the hustle and bustle of a big city?" And in the middle of the silence, a yes could be heard. In fact, many people have roosters in the cities. Immediately, a murmur broke out because someone had dared to contradict the Reverend. In the middle of the sermon, Moore lifted his head, and it was the first time he saw Blanche, who at 52 years old, looked beautiful. That first interaction was enough for Dwight Moore to fall head over heels for her. Once the sermon was over at breakfast, he was the one who directly approached Blanche and introduced himself to her. By Tuesday, he visited her home under the guise of making a pastoral visit, already knowing her address. He didn't find her, so he left his card on the door and waited for her to call him. That never happened. But before we continue, let's get to know Reverend Moore a little more deeply. He was 51 years old at that time and had studied at the Cleveland Bible University in Ohio. And in that place, he met a woman named Lorraine, who would later become his wife. Dwight Moore was married, but by this point in the story, he had already divorced. They graduated together, and then Dwight went to Duke's theology school. After that, he began his ministerial life. He was assigned to different churches where he lived with his wife and children, until he arrived at the Unity Church of Christ in Warwick. In Newport News, Virginia, this was the church he was at before he met Blanche, a church to which he dedicated 2 decades of his life. The parishioners loved Reverend Dwight Moore. He was an impeccable person. But what they didn't know was that in reality, the beloved preacher was having an extramarital affair with Elaine, his secretary, who also had a husband and children. They had been living a double life for 16 years and had decided that it was time to be together forever. So they devised a plan that in their minds was going to work perfectly. They were going to tell everything frankly. Dwight would tell Lorraine that he had been having an affair with his secretary for 16 years. Lorraine would get angry. But he hoped that over time, she would realize that with her public school teacher's salary, she could afford to rent a new house, while it would give Dwight the opportunity to stay in the parsonage. On the other hand, in this wonderful plan, Elaine would tell her husband he would also get angry, but he couldn't do anything about it. She had already said on numerous occasions that her marriage had ended in spirit many years ago. The members of the church would surely feel upset for a while, but everyone loved Dwight, and they surely couldn't forget all the years of service, all the nights he spent sitting, holding the hand of the dying, and all the times he was available for them, even in the early mornings. Surely, thinking about all this, he could keep his place in the church, and Elaine could go live with him as if she were his wife. Thus, with this flawless plan, they made their announcements, hoping that everything would turn out as they were thinking in their heads. I clearly say all this because it didn't happen that way. It immediately began to fall apart. The church abandoned them, causing Dwight to panic and tried to get back with his wife on the spot, but evidently she refused. She took the kids, moved out, and ended her marriage with Dwight decisively. And when he, finding himself alone, wanted to get back with Elaine, she told him she wasn't anyone's second choice and reconciled with her husband. The preacher had no choice but to go to his parents' house, on a farm, where he lived with his sister for a year. Then he was recommended to take a pastoral training course at the Baptist Hospital of North Carolina in Winston-Salem, where he provided companionship and counseling to patients. And little by little, he was called again to be a pastor, first as a substitute in some churches, and after a year, he was officially appointed. At a new church, precisely the church where he met Blanche, Dwight Moore was a handsome man, over 6 feet tall, elegant, well-spoken, cheerful, in addition to being a witty, simple, masculine man with impeccable manners and incapable of uttering a vulgarity, which Blanche simply referred to as a gentleman. So, after a few weeks, after returning from a trip to Florida that Raymond organized, hoping that now Blanche would agree to marry him, which, by the way, didn't work because she keeps telling him no, Dwight Moore went to visit Blanche again, and they agreed to go out to eat. In this meeting, Blanche told Dwight all about her lawsuit with Kroger and the fact that she was seeing a psychiatrist, by order of her lawyers, because they wanted to argue that Robert Hutton's harassment, he had made it nearly impossible for her to have a relationship with any other man. Dwight didn't care about any of this, so he was practically aware of everything that had happened, except, of course, for the romantic relationship Blanche had with Raymond, as she had told him they were just friends. Blanche and Dwight started seeing each other very often. They would go out to eat, for walks. He even came to her trailer. They would make dinner, have fun together, until the inevitable happened. Blanche kissed him and led him to the room. Did they become intimate that night and the following ones? Neither of them spoke about the possibility of marriage, but for Dwight, the fact that they slept together meant they were thinking about getting married. But something this man wanted to understand before any kind of commitment was the relationship that Blanche had with Raymond, especially after knowing that the latter had bought her a new car. To Blanche, she told him in 1,000 ways that they were just great friends. Dwight believed her, and after that, he started talking about getting engaged. On his part, Raymond was not having a good time at his job at all, due to Blanche's demand, which was also putting him in a tight spot. They had a relationship against what the Kroger policy stated. Everyone knew it, but no one dared to say anything, until one of the workers, named Monica, started to blackmail Raymond by threatening to reveal everything she knew about them and their relationship, unless they gave her the work schedules that suited her. In addition to mentioning that there was a preacher that Blanche was very interested in, this last bit paralyzed him. He confronted her, but Blanche told him not to overthink and to come visit her at her trailer because she would cook him a delicious dinner. 2 weeks after this, Raymond Reid began to suffer severe pains in his arms and legs, and he developed a terrible skin rash. He immediately went to his primary care physician, Dr. Norman Garrett, who diagnosed him with shingles. Of course, The main symptoms seemed to indicate that this was the condition Raymond had, but the numbness in his hands and feet was a desperate, desperate thing. He was given treatment for the pain, and Raymond returned to work with a bit of difficulty, trying to think about other things and longing to see his beloved Blanche, who was becoming more and more distant from him, and the only times they had contact, they ended up fighting. A result of the lawsuit against Kroger? Well, everyone at work was telling Raymond that Blanche had set a trap for Robert Hutton to make more money, which was true. And even though Raymond also believed it, he was the only one who stood up for her. What Blanche did to smooth things over with Raymond and always have him on her side was to prepare delicious dinners that he couldn't resist, while their health was getting worse and worse. On the other hand, Dwight and Blanche practically led a family life, and he loved doing things for her. So usually, Blanche would send him to do some shopping at a mini-market near Dwight's house, which sold certain products that she used for cleaning, including a bottle of ant insecticide called Anti-Ant. This is about a small bottle that contained a colorless and odorless liquid that came with the typical warning to keep out of the reach of children, since it had a sweet taste to the human palate, a taste that, of course, it hides. The 2% of arsenic that this solution carries. Blanche always used it, and Dwight thought it must work well, because he never saw a single ant in her house. Raymond Reid's health was plummeting drastically. Now he suffered from nausea, explosive vomiting, severe diarrhea, and abdominal pain that seemed to tear his guts apart. So Dr. Garrett, who knew him well and saw him getting worse, took giant steps, admitted him to Weasley Lawn Community Hospital in Greensboro for observation. He gave him treatment for his potential symptoms, but instead of improving, Raymond continued to deteriorate dramatically. His blood tests revealed an alarmingly low white blood cell count, with evidence that some external agent was simultaneously attacking the basic structure of all the elements of his blood. The following week, Raymond developed an acute urinary tract infection. The tip of his member became inflamed. His intestinal tract seemed to not function. His heart rate was too fast. His kidneys were failing, and his body began to swell alarmingly. His entire body was failing. In addition, Raymond suffered from general muscle weakness and a curious numbness and tingling in his hands and feet, which, if you paid attention to the story, seems to be a fairly recurring symptom in the narrative. Blanche used to be by his side. She had established a very hectic routine. She would wake up with Dwight every day. She would head to Greensboro to see Raymond for a while during the day, and she would question Dr. Garrett in detail about his condition. She would take care of any other business she had to attend to, often a visit to the lawyer or the psychiatrist, and then she would return to her trailer in Burlington in the evening and wait for Dwight's arrival. Raymond's infection was getting worse every moment and was not responding to antibiotics, so they had to circumcise him. It failed. July 13th, 1986. His kidneys stopped producing urine, so he was transferred to the Baptist Hospital of North Carolina in Winston-Salem, where at that time, Dr. Robert Hamilton, a specialist in internal medicine and nephrology, would be his primary doctor. Raymond Reid was a complete enigma. It was as if all the diseases known to man had come together to attack a single human being. He had skin rashes that formed open lesions on his legs and torso. His belly swelled. He had wheezing, retained abnormal amounts of fluid, and also had liver failure. Gradually, he began to lose lucidity. He didn't know where he was, and one after another, specialists arrived at the intensive care unit to determine what he had and give him appropriate treatment. The next day, Blanche arrived at the hospital impeccably dressed, introducing herself as his girlfriend to Lisa Sue Hutchins, the head nurse, to whom she asked about Raymond's condition. Lisa told her that he was very serious, but that the specialists were doing everything possible to help him, and she proceeded to explain the intensive care unit rules and visiting hours to her. In the afternoon, Blanche came back with cookies for all the nurses, which became a routine. And they loved it. So much so that the schedules and rules ceased to exist for Blanche. After a while, it seems that Raymond's suffering began to ease slightly. He was moved to intermediate care and started on a strict diet that consisted basically of purees. So Blanche asked Nurse Lisa Sue for permission to feed him something that poor Raymond would like more. Maybe that would cheer him up a bit. At first, Lisa refused, but then she considered it would be okay for Blanche to feed him. In the end, she loved him and was always there for him. Probably that would help in his recovery. It didn't. Raymond didn't get better. In fact, that very night was the first of a series of sudden and horrible relapses. His stomach turned completely, and the vomiting was extremely violent. His face turned completely purple. The membranes covering his eyeballs began to blister. He screamed and writhed in agony. The scene was difficult to watch, so he was immediately sedated and taken back to intensive care. There were good days when the treatments seemed to revive the weary Raymond a bit, but suddenly the symptoms would return. Blanche would arrive every morning with her Tupperware full of banana dessert, which was her boyfriend's favorite. She had clear Tupperware for the nurses and doctors, and an orange one for Raymond. In addition, she also brought him some milkshakes with peanut butter, which everyone loved. Dwight was uneasy about all the attention Blanche was giving Raymond, but she insisted it was a compassionate duty to help him. So, to prove her loyalty, she had Dwight take her to the hospital, where she clearly wouldn't let him in, because she said Raymond's condition was private. By this point, Blanche had already earned the consideration of everyone at the hospital, so she felt confident asking the nurses if they had noticed that Raymond's neuropathy had started with numbness in his hands and feet and seemed to be progressing up his limbs towards his body trunk. In addition to the respiratory symptoms that suggested a weakened diaphragm, indicating that it could be Guillain-Barré syndrome. They were surprised and responded that, yes, passing this information from doctor to doctor for them to take into account. Blanche had also put out a notice to Raymond's children about their father's serious condition. This came as a cold shower to them. They loved their father and visited him constantly, but Blanche convinced them that he wanted them not to neglect their studies. Perhaps this might sound good on her part, but some nurses heard Blanche repeatedly telling Raymond that his children were inconsiderate because they never came to see him. That same night, the alarms of the monitors went off. Raymond had stopped breathing and was connected to a ventilator on which his life now depended. "If Seal leaves, this is going to be a tragedy, Seal. Please stay." Dr. Hamilton suspected it was a massive blood infection. He discussed it with other doctors, and Blanche always reminded him that there was a possibility it could be Guillain-Barré syndrome. And was it true? This syndrome is characterized by numbness in the extremities that begins at the fingertips and toes, in addition to general weakness and mental confusion. But there were things that didn't fit with this syndrome, like, for example, the severe attacks that Raymond had, followed by recoveries and relapses. It was not common for that disease, so they thought it could be a case of heavy metal poisoning, which is the medical term for poisoning by lead, mercury, magnesium, thallium, or arsenic. So based on this, they ordered a test. The recent on duty, Dr. Darrell Thomas, was the one who ordered the test. This was obtained, but the same day the results arrived at the hospital. An event was taking place that happened every year at the same time. No, Sally, don't go. Medical students from all over the United States graduated, and the hospital residents, including Dr. Thomas, did a rotation. That is, they changed hospital or position. Before leaving, Dr. Thomas explained to the new resident that he would be in charge of Raymond, that they were waiting for the results of the heavy metal poisoning test, and that he had to be attentive. What they didn't know was that the test had already arrived and had already been added to Raymond's medical history. But he had so many new symptoms every day that those results got lost under mountains of new reports, and they never read them. Despite this, they performed a plasmapheresis, which is a procedure in which the patient's blood is extracted. The plasma is separated from the blood cells with a machine. These cells are mixed with a liquid that replaces the plasma, and the blood is returned to the patient. With this, Raymond surprisingly improved, regained consciousness, and started receiving visits from close friends. Obviously, Blanche was very happy and prepared a peanut butter milkshake to celebrate. Raymond said it was his favorite, and he drank it all. Blanche went to a meeting with her lawyers about her lawsuit with Cruel, and left him with a friend who had come to visit. A few hours passed, and suddenly, Raymond sat up abruptly in his bed. He opened his eyes, and a stream of vomit violently shot out of his mouth, followed by a strong garlic breath. He immediately began to swell, to the point of being unrecognizable, and was again transferred to intensive care. The next morning, when Blanche returned, the doctors spoke seriously with her and told her to prepare for the worst, because they didn't know what they were facing. Blanche took it calmly, communicated it to Raymond's children, and after a few hours returned with a lawyer and a document where it had been recorded, Raymond's last will, which was that all his assets and properties be divided equally among his 2 children and her. By that time, Raymond was not in a condition to sign anything, but the lawyer asked him the corresponding questions in front of the nurses as witnesses, and he affirmed his wish to leave 1/3 of all his belongings to Blanche. Nodding his head, the lawyer signed for him. Just 3 nights after this, his monitors sounded. His heart had stopped. They managed to revive him, but all their efforts were in vain. It was October 7th of 1986, and Raymond Reid had passed away. After a long ordeal, Blanche was blessed again with $22,556 in cash as a result of the equitable distribution of Raymond's inheritance. But in addition, when the deceased's children went to collect their father's life insurance policy, which was not included in the will, Blanche told the boys that Raymond's wish was for her to get 1/3 of everything he owned. So the young ones, who were devastated by the loss of their father, said they would respect his will and handed it over. $45,797, with an additional 33 cents. Obviously, this gave a twist to Blanche's economy, who just a month after Raymond's death, decided to get engaged to Reverend Dwight Moore, who gave her an expensive engagement ring. After all that Blanche had lived through, with so many significant losses for her, it seemed that life was finally smiling at her. A few months later, to her engagement, she managed to resolve her lawsuit with Kroger and obtained in her favor $275,000. And her marriage to Dwight was scheduled to take place after Thanksgiving. But suddenly, the couple's happiness vanished. Blanche was diagnosed with breast cancer and had to undergo a radical mastectomy and breast reconstruction. And as if that wasn't enough, out of nowhere, Dwight Moore fell ill and had to undergo 2 operations on his intestines. It turns out that just before the Thanksgiving celebrations, Dwight experienced a severe case of explosive vomiting, diarrhea, and a series of strange skin rashes in different parts of the body. When he went to the hospital, he was diagnosed with shingles. They gave him treatment, but nothing seemed to soothe him. He didn't even want to eat any food, because every time he did, a garlic aftertaste completely overwhelmed him, and the nausea became intense. So, after going through several tests, they confirmed through an X-ray that Dwight had a mass in his small intestine, probably a cancer that was slowly progressing. So, without waiting any longer, they decided to operate on him, and when they did, they found nothing. The mass had disappeared. The doctors were stunned. How was it possible that there was nothing more than one?
Inflammation, they were left
Baffled and simply concluded the operation, announcing that, fortunately, there were no signs of cancer in Dwight. Surprisingly, Dwight's recovery was much faster than that of an average patient. It seemed that he had so many healthy habits that were helping him quickly get out of that situation. So, as soon as he recovered, he told Blanche that it was time to get married, that they couldn't postpone their plans any longer. but she told him that he was too sick to be thinking about weddings. They were already cohabiting, as she was responsible for his care. So, a few days before the date they had set for the wedding, Dwight had a terrible relapse, and Blanche immediately canceled all the preparations. The 1st of December, 1988, Blanche rushed Dwight to the hospital in an emergency. Because he was shaking, pale, drenched in sweat, talking nonsense, had foamy vomit, and there was blood in his waist, in addition to having a generalized swelling that made it impossible or almost impossible to recognize him. They attended to him immediately, and when they checked him, they realized that his lungs were full of fluid. His kidneys were not producing urine, and in a new X-ray, his intestine looked full of masses. They decided to operate on him as an emergency, and once again, they found nothing. Fortunately for the Reverend, he was able to recover at an impressive speed and only stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks. Then, at the request of his sister, he went to spend the rest of his recovery at her house. He thought that Blanche had done too much taking care of him under those terrible conditions, so he preferred to give her a break, in case the symptoms, for some reason, reappeared. The truth is that Dwight was very embarrassed to lose his dignity in that way in front of Blanche. Because remember that one of his main symptoms were the vomiting and diarrhea that wouldn't stop. So he didn't want his beloved, his future wife, to witness something like that again. Obviously, Blanche didn't like this at all, who questioned Dwight if he didn't. Take good care of him. He explained the reasons, but she, nonetheless, got angry and did not contact him during the entire month he spent with his family. She didn't call him for New Year's, but he was patient with her, because as a church pastor, he had had to face what it was like to take care of a sick person and thought that could affect people. So he took Blanche's distancing very well. But in mid-January of 1989, when Dwight returned to his home, with no more symptom than the numbness of hands and feet, the first thing he did was call Blanche. He really loved her and wanted to see her. At first, she was reluctant, but little by little, Dwight worked hard to win her over again and managed to convince her to become his wife. So it was on the 21st of April, 1989, with Dwight's old friend and colleague, Reverend Jim Rosser, officiating the marriage, and 2 older women from the church as witnesses. Dwight Moore and Blanche Taylor got married. Blanche finally became Mrs. Blanche Taylor Moore. That weekend, they traveled to New Jersey for their honeymoon. Dwight had a new grandson he was eager to meet, so they went to his son Doug's house and had a beautiful weekend. On the way back home, Dwight started to feel a bit unwell again, but he didn't pay it any mind. So he arrived, put on his gardening clothes, and Blanche, for her part, went out to buy curtains. Dwight was already feeling better, so when Blanche arrived, they both sat down together to eat chicken sandwiches and iced tea that she had brought from the mall. They were chatting as normal, when suddenly Dwight stood up abruptly, interrupted by vomiting. He could no longer bear the stomach pain and nausea. He remained lying in his bed, writhing in pain, while Blanche spent her time arranging and hanging the curtains, then sleeping on the couch, just as she did the night James, her ex-husband, died. The next day, Dwight woke up feeling better and was regaining his strength, and he even felt up to eating the potato soup that Blanche had lovingly prepared for him. That night, he fell seriously ill again, so the next day she rushed him to the emergency room at Alamance County Hospital. He was sent to the intensive care unit, and it was determined that he had kidney failure, brain inflammation, respiratory problems, and his heart was out of control. Everything seemed to indicate that Dwight Moore was about to die, so the doctors decided to send him to North Carolina Memorial Hospital in Chapel Hill, where he stayed, under the care of Dr. David Wands, a third-year fellow in the cardiology department at the University of North Carolina. Dr. Wands was very thorough with medical histories, so he asked Blanche many questions related to what she was doing. Dwight Moore, moments before the sudden attack that Blanche suffered. Of course, she was always anxious and willing to cooperate with the doctors, so she told Dr. Wands that Dwight had spent the entire day working in his garden, trying to get rid of the weeds. The doctor continued questioning Blanche until she told him that Dwight was spraying his garden with herbicide. So this gave the doctor a clue that it could be a severe poisoning. So he ordered Blanche to bring all the pesticides, herbicides, or similar substances from her home to the hospital. At the same time, he ordered a complete toxicology test for Dwight. Another interesting fact to mention is that Debbie, Dwight's other daughter, was constantly calling Blanche to ask about her father's health condition, because in that last period of time, he wasn't answering her calls. Blanche would tell her that he was doing well, that he had just had a minor relapse of his past intestinal condition, but that he was already being treated at the North Carolina Memorial Hospital. The truth is that these brief responses did not convince Debbie at all, so she asked a nurse friend who lived in Hampton to contact the hospital where her father was, posing as her to ask all the necessary questions to know Dwight's true health status. So she did, and no one in the Moore family was prepared for what they were going to discover. Dwight was on the brink of death in the intensive care unit. Immediately, the entire Moore family, including Debbie and Doug, Dwight's children, along with their own children, partners, even Dwight's elderly father and his ex-wife Lorraine, set off to see the Reverend. When they arrived, the scene was sad and disheartening. To all the symptoms already mentioned, generalized tremors were added, followed by paralysis. He was grotesquely swollen, his eyes had suppurating blisters, and he was connected to an artificial respirator. The Moore family was coming to terms with the fact that the end was near for Dwight, but everything had happened so fast for them that they couldn't even believe what they were seeing, and the worst was yet to come. The results of the toxicology tests performed on Dwight came in, and this time, unlike what happened with Raymond Reid, Dr. Wands read them carefully several times and even called the lab to make sure there were no mistakes. There weren't any. The lab had triple-checked when they realized that Dwight Moore's system contained 20 times the lethal dose of arsenic, the highest amount of arsenic ever found in a living human in the history of that hospital. Enough to end the life of a large mammal, and even enough to force a change in the medical literature about the amount of arsenic a human being can survive. It was a case study. How was he even still alive? And everything made sense at that moment. The garlic breath, the explosive vomiting, the violent diarrhea, the lack of oxygen, the burning and numbness sensation in the hands and feet, the progressive paralysis, the irritation of the nose and throat, the incredible distension of the stomach, the swelling of the body, and in general, the terrible state of health, added to some other signs, like the lines of month on the nails, left no doubt. It was arsenic poisoning. And as for the masses that were seen in Dwight's x-rays and then disappeared, they were a kind of pools of arsenic that his body was struggling to excrete through his intestines. Dwight's group 10 out of 10. It was May 13th, 1989, and at 9:15 in the morning, Dr. Wands ordered all visitors to leave Dwight's room and only stay in the waiting room. He approached along with other doctors to the place where they expected to find their patient on the brink of death. But, miraculously, Dwight was showing signs of improvement. He still felt a lot of pain, he was in and out of lucidity, but when he was conscious, he was able to answer questions. The doctor gave him his results, and Dwight responded that perhaps the herbicide he used for his garden was to blame. But Wands, at this point, having checked so many times what the test said, didn't believe it. Regardless of how he had reached that level of poisoning, the important thing at that moment was to save his life. So the doctor told him about the treatment to save him, chelation, which could be quite painful. Chelation is a medical procedure that involves administering a chelating agent, that is, a substance that forms complexes with ions. To remove heavy metals from the body, the chelating agent is administered intravenously. It binds to the heavy metals and is excreted from the body through the kidneys. Dwight agreed with a glimmer of hope in his eyes, and the doctor knew immediately that his patient had not wanted to harm his own life. That is, he had not poisoned himself. By the way, the Moore family was anxious in the waiting room. When Dr. Wands, along with the hospital's chief of toxicology, Dr. Robert Edward Cross, approached them and gave the following reports. The first was that the medical staff was concerned about a generalized buildup of toxins in Dwight's body. The second, a piece of good news amidst all the chaos, was that his body was recovering. Thirdly, they told the family that tests had been conducted on the toxins of the products that Blanche had brought from home by the doctor's orders, and none matched the component that had caused this situation in Dwight. Lastly, they saved the most shocking news for the end. Reverend Moore has ingested a large amount of arsenic. It's such a large amount that the only way it could have gotten into his system is by being ingested orally or injected into a vein. So, for those reasons, a security person will be placed at the door of his room who will not allow anyone to enter other than medical personnel, not even his wife or children. Someone was trying to end the life of Reverend Dwight Moore. So, while the treatment was taking effect, it was time to notify the authorities and start an investigation. It was May of 1989, and Dr. Wands contacted the State Bureau of Investigation, known as the State Bureau of Investigation, which translates to Spanish as Oficina Estatal de Investigación. At this place, they assigned Agent David McDougal as the person in charge of the case, the same one who would be assisted by Phil Ayers, special agent sent by the Sheriff of Alamance, the place where the case had started. Before the agents could meet with Dwight Moore, who was gradually spending more time lucid and awake. First, they spoke with Dr. Wands, who told them everything about Dwight's medical history, and they, for their part, conducted their own investigation. It turns out that in North Carolina, there was a long gallery of arsenic murderers. One of them, perhaps the most well-known, is Velma Barfield, a serial killer responsible for a total of 5 poisonings. She was the first woman executed in the United States after a 22-year hiatus, having been sentenced to capital punishment. Its resumption in 1976. But there was a man who was on that list. His name was Robert F. Coulthard, a man who married Sandra Coulthard, daughter of a prominent furniture-making family from High Point. Robert started having an affair soon after his wedding. He secretly took out a $351,000 life insurance policy on his wife. And then he slowly ended Sandra's life through several doses of arsenic. Now, this case was relevant to Moore's investigation because Sandra had died just a year before this event. And something her doctors thought, before determining the cause of her illness, was that Sandra had developed Guillain-Barré syndrome. Due to the numbness that was felt in hands and feet, something that might sound familiar to you because of everything I'm telling you. Agents McDougal and Ayers gathered all the information they needed and decided it was time to talk to Dwight. They weren't going to immediately tell him that someone was attempting to kill him. First, they started asking him questions about his family, how often he saw his children, and if he had any life insurance. Regarding the latter, he did have them. There were 3. And they were worth in total no more and no less than $250,000. Once he passed away, the beneficiaries of these life insurances were his 2 children and his wife. Of course, Dwight began to notice where the investigation was going, so he became a bit fearful about the information regarding his past. They asked him about his ex-wife when he lived in Virginia, but they also asked if there was anyone else in that place with whom he had been close. Or so it was until that day. Dwight felt terrible. He immediately imagined that telling the agents about his 16-year affair with his secretary, Elaine, was going to be the end of him. Once again, stripped of his position and forbidden from resuming his pastoral duties. But the agents only wanted names to be able to point to a particular suspect. As often happens in such cases, the agents asked Dwight about his wife Blanche being a widow. He knew that James Taylor had died of natural causes, due to heart problems, but they asked him if there wasn't anyone else closer to his wife who had recently died. Dwight immediately remembered Raymond Reid. He told them he had a close friend named Raymond Reid, who was a co-worker at Kroger. He was very sick and died, but Blanche had taken care of him and done a lot for him. By that time, remember that 3 years had already passed. When asked what he died of or what they thought he had died of, the Reverend replied that he had Guillain-Barré syndrome. The agents were perplexed and frozen by these obvious facts. Was so many coincidences possible? The path was clearing up, but there was still a long way to go. When the agents leave this place, they come across Blanche yelling at a nurse and accusing her of being the one who was poisoning Dwight, because she was responsible for feeding him. Everyone present was trying to calm her down, so the agents approached her and introduced themselves. She immediately changed her tone to one that denoted distress and told them that she needed to talk to them because she had information that could be relevant. Blanche told them that the day Dwight was working in her garden with the herbicides, he went into the bathroom. He washed his hands and dried them with a towel that she used a few moments later to dry her face. Blanche tells them that at that very moment, she began to feel an intense burning sensation on her face, that she had to go get something injected for the inflammation. So surely some of those products were the ones that harmed her husband. The agents already knew that none of the products from the house that Blanche had brought in for analysis contained arsenic. So they simply noted what she told them and went on their way. That night, Dwight Moore called Agent McDougal and asked him to please come see him because he needed to talk to him. When he arrived, Dwight directly asked him if they were thinking that Blanche was the one trying to murder him. McDougal responded that he had strong suspicions, and the Reverend told him that it was then time to stop the investigation because he would never press charges against his wife, because she was a good, impeccable woman, and also she made him very happy. The agent informed Dwight that the Reverend declined to press charges as the case was already in progress. The investigation would continue its course, but it would be ideal to have his cooperation. Dwight tried to understand it. He was not completely convinced, but he thanked the people for having come to talk to him. And he casually mentioned that he was expecting a haircut the next day. The agent asked him why he would cut it, and Dwight replied that Blanche had been obsessed with cutting his hair since that morning. So he agreed, and his wife would go with his brother Parker Davis the next day for him to do the cut. The suspicions increased. McDougal knew that traces of arsenic, even when they were no longer in the blood, remained in the hair and nails, so she had to act immediately. She asked Dwight for permission and removed between 30 and 40 hairs from the root, as it was necessary for the test to be performed from the follicles. With every passing second, Dwight became a little more upset and began to question whether Blanche really wanted to hurt him. Now yes, the next step for the State Bureau of Investigation agents was to gather information from all the people close to Blanche who had lost their lives over the years, in order to find matches. That's how they reviewed the file of 22 people who could have been victims of Blanche. And initially, on June 13th, 1989, it was decided to exhume Raymond Reid to perform an autopsy. His body was quite well preserved, and the results showed that he had arsenic levels that were 30 times higher than normal. And in his brain, they were 67 times higher. In addition to this, Raymond had the typical marks known as Mises lines, which are white bands that appear on the fingernails and toenails of people who have been poisoned with arsenic. And they can even help to generate a timeline. While the appropriate tests were being conducted, Agents McDougal and Ayers went to the hospital to interrogate Blanche, not only about her husband Dwight's medical history, but also about Raymond Reid. Blanche told the two detectives that she had returned all of Raymond Reid's money to his children, except for $40,000, which, she said, he had specifically bequeathed to her. McDougal knew that Blanche was lying. She hadn't returned anything to Raymond's children because he had already spoken to them. Blanche also falsely stated that she was unaware of Dwight's pension fund. McDougal had already interviewed an official from the United Church of Christ, who mentioned that Blanche had already approached to get the Reverend's pension papers. Even, Blanche said that she asked the nurses for permission to cut Dwight's hair, but evidently it was another one of her lies, and the one that would later play most against her was that she flatly denied that she brought homemade food to Raymond Reid when he was hospitalized, when there were dozens of witnesses who claimed that it had been so. The agents chose to give Blanche a polygraph, also known as a lie detector test. And although we know that this test is used more to corroborate people's attitudes and perhaps obtain some kind of confession, Blanche denied having supplied the arsenic to Dwight Moore, as well as to Raymond Reid. She stood firm in her statements, despite the fact that she actually didn't pass the test. As soon as Blanche left the place, new information reached the agents. her colleagues had gone to the hospital where Raymond died to review his thick medical history for themselves. And there it was lost, in the midst of all the evidence, the report of heavy metal poisoning. The same one that obviously revealed what they already knew. Raymond Reid had been poisoned with arsenic many times, even while in the hospital. A hard moment had come. For the case, McDougal needed Dwight Moore to be fully aware of the investigation results. So he headed to his room, and after a pleasant conversation, the State Bureau of Investigation agent told him it would be a day of bad news. At that moment, they told the Reverend the whole truth. Not only was he being poisoned, but also, Raymond Reid was his wife's lover and had died from lethal doses of arsenic while he was in the hospital. This news was a bombshell for Dwight, who asked people to please remove Blanche from his house and tell his family to get him a lawyer because he wanted her out of all his financial affairs. Finally, Reverend Moore had accepted that his wife had not only tried to murder him, but had also played with his feelings. A few hours later, Dwight asked to speak with Blanche and told her that their marriage was over and he didn't want to see her again. Blanche just nodded, said goodbye, and left. But the investigation was not over yet. One by one, the deceased close to Blanche, who died under suspicious circumstances, were exhumed. James Taylor, her first husband, was exhumed on July 6th, and the autopsy revealed he had 60 times the normal level of arsenic. Enough to kill him, not only him, but also a horse. Isla Taylor, James's mother, and Blanche's mother-in-law also showed high amounts of arsenic in her body. Not enough to be lethal, but enough for her existing illnesses to progress, deteriorating her body much faster. Parker Davis Kisser, Blanche's father, was also exhumed after having been 23 years underground. And obviously, his body was extremely deteriorated. But even so, the extremely high levels of arsenic in his body could be verified. In addition, they exhumed a man named Joseph C. Mitchell, a Kroger butcher, who died of a heart attack while working in the same store as Blanche. But he showed no signs of poisoning. So it was that on July 18th, 1989, at the age of 56, Blanche Taylor Moore was arrested while dining in her daughter Cindy's trailer, along with her family. Blanche was accused of having murdered her father, Parker Kisser, her first husband, James Taylor, her boyfriend, Raymond Reid, in addition to the attempted murder committed against Dwight Moore. The first trial that took place was for the murder of Raymond Reid, because it was the best documented. Not only did she have a very long medical history that I have been telling you about throughout this video, in addition to the autopsy results, which were more than conclusive, there were also dozens of witnesses, from nurses and hospital staff where Raymond spent his last days, to relatives who were willing to testify against Blanche. Something else that should be mentioned here is that Blanche spent this entire process in prison because the day after her arrest, a hearing was held in which it was decided that there would be no bail for her to leave and stand trial in freedom, because the crimes for which she was being prosecuted included capital punishment as a sentencing option, that is, the death penalty, so they could not let her go free. The trial of Blanche Taylor Moore began on October 15th, 1990, in Fawcett County, a highly publicized trial that was in all the local media and, of course, on everyone's lips. The prosecution said that Blanche began to poison Raymond Reid with arsenic in early 1986 and continued to do so while he was hospitalized. Through this banana dessert and her peanut butter shakes, the prosecution also presented evidence that Blanche killed her first husband, James Taylor, and was planning to do the same with Dwight Moore. And did they accept these other cases as evidence for Raymond's case? Because there was a strong enough pattern to say that it was even her modus operandi. First, she would supply doses of arsenic to her companions. They would get sick. She would become their main caregiver, and that would allow her to continue supplying them with that fatal substance. Everything seemed to indicate that Blanche Taylor Moore was a serial killer, but they also had to analyze the motives. The prosecution proposed 3 hypotheses about this. The first was that Blanche preferred to get rid of her partners when she started to become interested in someone else, because she cared too much about keeping up appearances. So without them in the way, she would avoid the gossip of other people. The second was that Blanche hated men because they reminded her of her father, who, if you remember, was an abusive and mistreating individual, and somehow she saw a bit of him in all men. The third hypothesis, which was 100% verifiable and was used to give the sentence, is that Blanche ended her relationships for economic reasons, thus becoming the perfect example of a black widow. This type of serial killers categorized by Michael Kelleher, who precisely follow these characteristics, was more than clear. Blanche inherited a third of Raymond Reid's estate, bought a house with the money she inherited from James Taylor, and, as Dwight Moore's wife, would inherit his estate once he passed away. But she didn't count on things being different. On this occasion, Dwight Moore testified against his still wife during the trial, and it was at that moment that he remembered that Blanche sent him to buy the anti-ant insecticide, the one that has arsenic in its composition, the same one she had used to end each of her victims. Dwight Moore, unknowingly, had bought his own murder weapon. Another thing that is interesting to mention is that during the trial, a subject appeared, an admirer of Blanche, named Garvin Thomas, a homeless man who was determined to talk to Blanche. He sent her teddy bears to jail and wrote her letters constantly, letters that she, of course, did not answer. Until one day, a peculiar letter arrived at the prison, one in which he incriminated himself for all the crimes he was accused of. Blanche. Garvin said he had ended the lives of the 3 men who had been with Blanche because he was jealous, but something didn't add up. Blanche presented this letter as evidence when Garvin had already passed away. The prosecution brought in their experts and compared the letter with known writings of Garvin, as well as having Blanche write a copy of it. Prosecutor Janet Branch was the first to believe that Blanche had written the letter herself, not only because of the similarities in handwriting, but because the letter ends with a distinctive mark of the woman, obscene phrases, and references to sex. Finally, the prosecutor managed to take this letter as proof that Blanche was doing everything possible to absolve herself of blame. Blanche always maintained her innocence, and even, despite all the nurses who testified to have seen her feeding Raymond Reid in the hospital, she continued to deny it emphatically. But all the evidence was against her. So, on November 14, 1990, Blanche Taylor Moore was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Raymond Reid. And 2 days later, on November 16, 1990, she was sentenced to death. Due to this sentence, the other cases involving the death of James Taylor and the attempted murder of Dwight Moore were never tried. 2 weeks later, Dwight Moore filed for divorce. To this day, Blanche Taylor Moore is 91 years old and is the oldest woman waiting to be executed on death row in the United States. She is at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women. You might be wondering, why was she never executed? It turns out that Blanche has spent her entire life in prison, appealing her sentence over and over again, alleging various technical issues committed during her trials. So in this way, she has been able to avoid her execution for more than 34 years. And of course, she continues to declare her innocence to this day. She, in fact, had to undergo several sessions of chemotherapy and radiotherapy due to recurring cancers, but she remains in stable health to this day. Composed music and poetry while imprisoned. Conversely, Reverend Dwight Moore, the survivor, moved on with his life. He married again and moved to Virginia, where he was assigned to a church, where he worked until the end of his life. Dwight died of natural causes on January 11, 2013, aged 79. But they should know that the numbness in his hands and feet caused by arsenic never stopped accompanying him. I'm not sure what Blanche's goal was in all of this, whether it was just to have money or to have a particular house or a particular life. But let's say that all in all, she got her way, because she's still alive and she's calm in a prison cell. And let's say that if the Reverend's daughter hadn't realized that something was off, maybe he would have died. She would have inherited all his things and the story. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know what you think as I'm reading them. Here are the Patreons and channel members. Thank you for supporting me through those means. And with nothing else to say, here's a new video. Here's a recommended video. You can subscribe by clicking on my face and see you in another video. Goodbye.